When we look into measuring prejudice and discrimination, right, like in a scientific study, we're going to measure, we're going to run research on it, we're going to get data, we're going to analyze that data. So measuring prejudice and discrimination, and we're talking about specifically this test that is called the Implicit Association Test, or the IAT. This is the test that is done on discrimination and prejudice. So the Implicit Association Test, or IAT, measures attitudes about which people might not be consciously aware that they have, as well as those attitudes that they are aware of, but they wish to keep hidden. So with the Implicit Association Test, you're either going to find prejudices or discriminations that you aren't even consciously aware of, or that you are aware of, but you don't want others to know. So what happens is you give these automatic instant reactions to the most valid indicator of what they actually believe. So you may give, on the implicit association test, there may be a word, and you're supposed to think of the first word that comes to your mind. Or you're shown a picture, and the first thing that comes to your mind without giving any thought whatsoever. And based on your answers, right, that can show your level perhaps of prejudice or discrimination. And what we find is almost 90% of test takers have an implicit pro-white bias, and more than 80% of heterosexuals display an implicit bias against gays and lesbians. Almost 90% of test takers have an implicit pro-white bias. And more than 80% of heterosexuals display an implicit bias against gays and lesbians. Now remember the difference between prejudice and discrimination. You can have prejudicial thoughts without acting out on them, without discriminating. So note that having an implicit bias does not mean that people will overtly discriminate. However, it does reveal the unconscious influence of the cultural lessons which we are exposed to. Now, this slide, this is figure 1 in your textbook, and you can see on this right along the x-axis are the years that this was done, and then on the y-axis is the negativity of implicit attitudes. So the dark line is the red line on the screen. It's dark on mine because I have it printed out in black and white. But the red line is the implicit sexuality attitudes, and the green line is the implicit race attitudes. And those have really come down. However, you will see, right, that they came down in 2008 to 2009. And then they kind of, whenever it comes to race, they kind of actually increased to 2012. And then there has been this ongoing decrease. Now, this only went to 2016. I don't know whether we would continue to see this now or whether there would be somewhat of an increase based on what is happening in our society lately. But whenever it comes to implicit sexuality attitudes, you can definitely see this kind of decrease. There from 2011 to 2012, there was an increase, but then it started to come back down again. So the last thing that I want to talk about in this module is how do we reduce the consequences of prejudice and discrimination? How do we reduce the consequences of prejudice and discrimination? Psychologists have developed several effective strategies for doing this. One is that they can increase contact between the target of stereotyping and the holder of the stereotype. So increase contact between the person who has the stereotypical thoughts and the person they have them against. Increase the contact between those two. And that should possibly, hopefully, decrease some of that prejudice and discrimination. You can also make values and norms against prejudice more conspicuous. Put it more out there. You know, a lot of people like to hide behind their words, especially on social media when it's not face-to-face. Make it a lot more conspicuous, and maybe people would not be as prejudiced and discriminatory. Provide information about the targets of stereotyping. You have stereotypical thoughts about this group. Provide information about that group to show that your thoughts or beliefs are incorrect. Reduce that stereotype threat. A lot of times we have these stereotypical thoughts and prejudice and discriminations because we see them as a threat, because they are not like us. Well, reduce that feeling of threat. And then the last one is increase the sense of social belonging of ethnic minority students. Increasing the sense of social belonging of ethnic minority students. Make them feel more like they are part of the campus. Not too surprisingly, research has shown that African Americans in particular suffer from stereotype vulnerability, which is where obstacles to perform that stem from their obstacles to performance that stem from their awareness of society stereotypes. They don't feel as comfortable. And so they're not going to perform to where they could be because they don't feel comfortable doing so. So make them feel more comfortable. Okay, that is Module 54.